Brother O, Dr. O, good to see you. Good
Good
to
to see
see
you as
you.
well. Thanks so much for
Um,
having me.
you know, at Real Talk, we try and keep it informal. So we go with either first names or what people like to be called. Um, so let me first say how proud I am of your intellectual work. I think you're putting out some very good stuff. And I'm especially proud that you also are a scholar activist. So many folk in the field are what we might want to call public intellectuals, meaning that they comment on what's happening in society, but they're not engaged in actually trying to change things. That Marx's fear of the fear about resolution number 11, the one that says that the goal is not merely to, you know, philosophize about the world, but it is to actually change it. So I appreciate that you are engaged in changing it. I also appreciate that you're one of a very relatively small group of young historians, largely Black, who are seeking to expand this idea of Black power studies beyond its generally narrow focus on the Black Panther Party, and that you're working to free the field from the kind of liberal straitjacket that Peniel Joseph has encased it in. So now I want to urge you to be succinct, but also to be as comprehensive as you need to be. And you should be aware, you know me. So my style is that I will interrupt. Sometimes it's to push you to a conclusion. That's what I'm doing this. Wrap it up, right? Um, but I will also challenge some ideas. Well, I don't know if I will with you, but it's possible, right? Um, so now, I always begin this show with the biographical. I want people to know who you are. I want you to make those kinds of comments. So we, I'm interested, and my audience is interested in what were the incidents and processes that you experienced that helped you to make the transition from what we call the Negro to Black conversion process or develop the Black identity, right?
Yeah.
So my first question goes to your youth. You're born in San Antonio, Texas. At the age of 5, you went to Virginia Beach. I imagine that's a pretty different. That might be a shock, but at any rate, I think you're raised in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So I want you to talk about that time period in Virginia Beach and your class background and how these things influence you to get a PhD in history with a specialization in African American history and your social movement commitments, right? Particularly your commitment to radical Black nationalist politics. So, would you talk about specific experiences, observations, mentors, and readings and processes that contributed to your intellectual interest and your political engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the question. And I always like to start this type of response with my love of music and in particular hip hop culture, rap music. I start there because when I first started to listen, become involved with hip hop culture, I mainly was being exposed. So I was being exposed to everything, the party music, all that type of stuff. I also was being exposed to people who were trying to bring something a little more, I guess, intelligent through the microphones, such as KRS-One,
Okay.
Jungle Brothers, Poor Righteous Teachers, groups like that.
What about the
And
group?
what about the coup? That was a little bit later for me. That was more high school for me. But definitely all these types of groups, again, by high school, Dead Prez was hugely influential on me. They were giving me language to start to think about my experience at this point as a Black child who knew I was Black because I would grew up around mostly majority white people in a naval town called Virginia Beach, Virginia, right, where the politics are all about the military, right? I'm also from a
Mhm.
military family, which explains the moves. And as I'm listening to this music and paying attention to what's going on around me, I just started to raise questions. I also should say my parents played a huge role because, in their own ways, my mom was interested in history. She always made sure that we knew who Martin Luther King Jr. was, stuff like that. And my dad, he expressed in various ways what I think a lot of scholars might call community nationalism, where he
Mhm.
would do things like root for the Black basketball teams with the Black coaches, that type of stuff, right? And a lot of people might dismiss some of that, but for me, I think that that really mattered. I was paying attention to these things, and it was teaching me to have an affinity with and pride for my people. And it also helped that my grandmother, by the late 80s, started to put Kwanzaa stuff up around the house every December, right? And so I'm exposed to these things. Nobody was really explaining what all of it meant, but I at least had an awareness of it. And through some of the lyrics that I was picking up in the rap music, I started to make sense of it. And then by the time we get to like 98, their prez, Let's Get Free comes out. I'm primed for that type of message. And the
Mm.
final thing that I'll say in terms of early influences, I've always loved reading, right? I always knew that I wanted to do something with my brain, even as a child. But the book that really put me on this path, well, first is an autobiography of Malcolm X, but I was really into fiction, and The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison's what really did
Wow.
it for me. What
Okay.
really, because I could recognize in that book some of the early critiques I was beginning to form about myself, about family, about the people I'm around, because in terms of things like colorism and all that, I'm seeing these things as I'm growing up, and I
Mhm.
subscribed to some of it, and I didn't like it, right?
So
And
now,
so,
so
yeah, go ahead.
are you referring to colorism within your family or within the community?
More within the community. One thing I always tell my parents I'm proud of them for is they didn't push the whole light skin love thing.
Okay.
We have a variety of shades and tones and all that stuff in my family. And if anything, I hate to say it, if anything, it was some of the more lighter skinned people who used to get some of the abuse, right? Because
Mhm.
we have people with red hair and stuff in my family, and they got it more than some of the darker folks in my family. So it's nothing to be proud of, but it just wasn't the standard that I'm hearing from my peers, where they're talking about, especially the guys, I need that light skinned girl, this and that. It's like with the long hair. I that was a foreign idea to me. That was a foreign idea to me when I started hearing about that. So it wasn't as visible in my family as it was just in the community in general.